A young black girl, wrongly accused of shoplifting, finds herself handcuffed and scared, facing a stern cop who won't listen. But what he doesn't know is that her father owns the very store she was accused of robbing. Sit back and watch. Let us know where you are watching from. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and the shopping area was bustling with people going about their day. Among the crowd was Adriel, a cheerful 12-year-old black girl who was excitedly making her way into a grocery store. She was on a mission to buy ingredients for a surprise dessert she planned to make for her mom that evening. Adriel loved to bake, and she had spent the whole morning looking up recipes on her phone. Her dad, who owned a small store nearby, had asked her to pick up a few things for him, too, so she was ready to shop. Adriel wore a yellow dress with tiny flowers, a pair of white sneakers, and a bright smile. She had her small purple backpack with her, carrying her phone and a list of things to buy. She carefully browsed through the aisles, picking out the items she needed: flour, chocolate chips, sugar, and a few other things her dad had mentioned. As she stood in front of the candy shelf, she pulled out her phone to double-check the recipe one last time. She couldn't wait to get home and start baking. Meanwhile, Officer Austin was standing near the entrance of the store, watching people as they came and went. He was a tall, serious-looking man, known for being strict and stern. Today, he was on patrol, and he had been keeping an eye on the store for any suspicious activity. He noticed Adriel walking around with her backpack and phone and decided to keep an eye on her. She seemed to be moving slowly, looking at her phone, and he thought she was acting strangely. As Adriel finished picking out everything she needed, she headed to the checkout counter. She waited in line, humming softly to herself, happy with her selections. But just as she stepped closer to pay, Officer Austin approached her. His face was serious, and his eyes were cold. "Hey, you," he said, stepping in front of Adriel. "What's in the backpack?" Adriel looked up, surprised. She wasn't sure why the officer was talking to her, but she answered politely, "Oh, just my phone and some snacks I brought from home." Officer Austin's eyes narrowed. "Show me," he ordered, his voice stern. Adriel hesitated for a moment, feeling confused. She slowly took off her backpack and opened it, showing him the inside. There was nothing but her phone, a small notebook, and a water bottle. But Officer Austin wasn't convinced. "What about the other stuff?" he said, pointing at the basket of groceries she was carrying. "Did you steal that?" Adriel's eyes widened in shock. "No, sir. I was just about to pay for it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have my money right here." She reached into her pocket to show him the cash she had, but Officer Austin grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Don't lie to me," he snapped. "I saw you walking around the store, looking at your phone. You were trying to find a way to sneak out without paying, weren't you?" Adriel felt a mix of fear and confusion. "No, sir, I promise. I'm not stealing. I was just checking my recipe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't understand why he was accusing her of such a thing. She felt a lump forming in her throat, and her eyes started to sting with tears. But Officer Austin wasn't listening. "That's enough," he said, pulling her by the arm. "We're going outside, and I'm calling for backup. You're coming with me." As he led her out of the store, Adriel could see people staring. Some whispered to each other, and a few even took out their phones to record. She felt embarrassed, scared, and helpless, but she kept trying to explain. "Please, sir, I didn't do anything wrong. I was going to pay. You can check with the store workers," she pleaded, but Officer Austin didn't respond. He had already made up his mind. Outside the store, he called for backup, and within a few minutes, another police car arrived. Adriel stood there, her hands shaking, trying to hold back her tears. She felt like she was in a nightmare. She had only wanted to buy some ingredients, and now she was being treated like a criminal. As Officer Austin spoke to his colleague, Adriel heard him say, "Caught her trying to sneak out with unpaid goods. We're taking her to the station." Hearing those words made her heart drop. She didn't know what to do. She thought about her dad and wished she could just call him. Maybe he would know how to fix this. "Can I please call my dad?" she asked softly, but Officer Austin shook his head. "Not now. We'll handle that at the station," he said, his voice firm. Adriel felt a tear roll down her cheek as she stood there, feeling more alone than ever. She didn't understand why this was happening to her, and no matter how much she tried to explain, no one seemed to believe her. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about what she did or didn't do. It felt like Officer Austin had already decided she was guilty, and nothing she said could change his mind. As the police car pulled up, Adriel's heart pounded. She could only hope that someone would listen to her and that everything would be okay. But for now, all she could do was wait, scared and unsure of what would happen next. Adriel sat in the back of the police car, her heart pounding and her hands shaking. She had never felt so scared and confused in her life. Her eyes were wet with tears, and she could barely see through them as she looked out the window. Everything around her felt like a blur. She couldn't understand why this was happening. One moment she was happily picking out ingredients to bake a surprise dessert, and the next she was being treated like a criminal. Officer Austin drove the car with a stern expression, his eyes fixed on the road. He didn't say a word to Adriel, and every time she tried to speak, he just told her to be quiet. "You'll have your chance to explain yourself later," he said, his voice cold and unkind. "But right now, you need to understand that stealing is against the law, and you're going to face the consequences." Adriel's chest tightened with fear. "But I wasn't stealing," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was going to pay for everything. I swear." Officer Austin glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but his expression didn't change. "That's what they all say," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You kids think you can get away with anything." The car ride felt like it lasted forever. Adriel's mind was racing. She kept thinking about her dad and how he would react when he found out what happened. She could imagine his worried face, trying to figure out how to help her. "If only I could call him," she thought. "He would fix everything." But Officer Austin had taken her phone away, and she felt more alone than ever. When they arrived at the police station, Officer Austin roughly opened the car door and guided Adriel out. She stumbled a little as she stepped onto the sidewalk, still in shock. The police station was a big gray building, and it looked intimidating. Adriel's heart sank as she realized she was about to be taken inside. People passing by on the street stared at her, some whispering and pointing. She felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She wanted to shout that she was innocent, that this was all a mistake, but her voice felt stuck in her throat. Officer Austin walked her through the front doors and into a small room with a desk. He sat her down on a chair, and Adriel could see other police officers walking around, talking and typing on computers. It felt like everything was moving too fast, like she was in a bad dream that she couldn't wake up from. "Sit here and don't move," Officer Austin ordered, pointing to the chair. "We're going to sort this out." Adriel sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. She felt small and powerless. Every now and then, she would try to speak up, but Officer Austin would just shush her and tell her to wait. After a few minutes, he started filling out some paperwork, writing down information and shaking his head as he did. Caught red-handed, he muttered to himself, loud enough for Adriel to hear. Can't believe she thought she could just walk out with those groceries. Adriel's eyes filled with tears again. She couldn't believe how mean he was being. She wanted to explain, to tell him that she wasn't trying to sneak anything out, but every time she opened her mouth, he would give her a look that made her feel like she was already guilty, no matter what she said. As she sat there, Adriel noticed some of the other police officers glancing at her. They didn't look mean like Officer Austin, but they didn't seem to be helping her either. Some of them just looked curious, while others seemed to feel sorry for her. But no one came over to ask her if she was okay. It was like they were all too busy to care about what was happening to her. After a while, Officer Austin picked up a phone and made a call. Adriel listened as he spoke to someone on the other end, describing her as a young girl caught shoplifting. Hearing those words made her heart ache. It felt like a lie, but it was a lie that everyone seemed to believe. When he hung up, Officer Austin turned back to Adriel. "You're going to stay here for a little while," he said, almost as if he was talking to a misbehaving child. "Then we're going to take your picture and write up a report, and maybe you'll understand why stealing is wrong." Adriel felt a tear roll down her cheek. She didn't know how to make him see that he was wrong, that she wasn't a thief. She had never stolen anything in her life. All she wanted was to go home, to be with her family, and to forget that this horrible day had ever happened. "Please, sir," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I just call my dad? He'll tell you I wasn't stealing. He knows I wouldn't do that." Officer Austin hesitated for a moment. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he brushed it off, thinking she was just trying to get out of trouble. "We'll see," he said, not making any promises. "For now, you're going to have to wait." Adriel looked down at her hands, feeling helpless. She had never felt so alone. As the minutes ticked by, she wondered if anyone would believe her, or if she was going to be stuck in this nightmare forever. She could only hope that someone would listen to her side of the story before it was too late. Adriel sat alone in the small, cold room at the police station, feeling more scared and helpless than ever. She had never been in trouble before, and now she was in a place she didn't understand, with no one there to help her. Her hands were shaking, and she tried to stop the tears from falling. But it was no use. She wished she could wake up and find out that all of this was just a terrible dream. Officer Austin had left her alone for a while, and she could hear the muffled sounds of people talking and phones ringing outside. The room felt empty, and the silence was almost unbearable. Every time Adriel thought about what had happened, she felt a mix of fear and sadness. She hadn't done anything wrong, but here she was, being treated like she had committed a serious crime. "Why won't anyone listen to me?" she thought, trying to keep herself from crying again. After what felt like hours, the door opened, and Officer Austin stepped back inside. He had a stern look on his face as he carried a piece of paper and a pen. He placed them on the desk in front of Adriel. "We're going to take down a statement," he said in a voice that sounded more like a command than a request. "Tell me exactly what happened, and don't even think about lying." Adriel felt her chest tighten. She wanted to speak, but she was scared that no matter what she said, Officer Austin wouldn't believe her. Still, she knew she had to try. "I went to the store to buy some things," she began, her voice trembling. "I had a list, and I was going to pay for everything. I wasn't trying to steal. I promise." Officer Austin didn't seem convinced. He scribbled some notes on the paper, but he didn't look up at Adriel. "That's not what it looked like to me," he said. "You were wandering around, looking at your phone, and you tried to leave without paying." "No, sir, I wasn't," Adriel said, shaking her head. "I was looking at a recipe. I was just trying to make sure I got all the right ingredients. I had the money with me." She reached into her pocket, but then remembered that Officer Austin had already taken everything away when they got to the station. She felt even more trapped. Officer Austin sighed, still not looking at her. "That's what they all say," he muttered. "I'm sure your parents taught you better than this, but you're going to learn that actions have consequences." Adriel felt her heart sink. She wanted to scream that she wasn't lying, that she was telling the truth, but it seemed like nothing she said was getting through to him. She thought about her dad, and an idea came to her. It was a small glimmer of hope, and she clung to it desperately. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "Can I call my dad? He owns a store nearby. He knows me. He knows I wouldn't steal." Officer Austin stopped writing and finally looked up at her. There was a slight frown on his face, and for a moment he seemed confused. "Your dad owns a store?" he asked, as if the idea surprised him. "Why didn't you say that before?" "I tried," Adriel said, feeling a little more hopeful. "I kept trying to tell you, but you wouldn't listen." Please, just let me call him. He can explain everything." She could feel the tears welling up again, but she blinked them away, trying to stay strong. Officer Austin hesitated. He thought about everything that had happened so far, and part of him still believed that Adriel was just trying to get out of trouble, but another part of him was starting to feel uncertain. He had been so sure that she was guilty, but now he wasn't so sure. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "You can make one phone call. But if you're lying, this is only going to make things worse for you." Adriel's hands shook as Officer Austin handed her a phone. She quickly dialed her dad's number, praying that he would pick up. The phone rang once, twice, and then she heard his familiar voice on the other end. "Hello, Dad," Adriel said, her voice cracking as she tried to keep herself from crying. "It's me. I'm at the police station. They think I was stealing, but I wasn't. Can you come, please?" There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and then her dad's voice came through, calm but serious. "I'm on my way, Adriel. Don't worry. I'll be there soon." Adriel felt a wave of relief wash over her. She didn't know how her dad was going to fix this, but just hearing his voice made her feel safer. She handed the phone back to Officer Austin, who watched her carefully, still trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. As they waited, the room felt tense. Officer Austin was silent, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now. Maybe, just maybe, he had been too quick to judge. But he didn't say anything, and Adriel didn't dare speak again. She just sat there, her hands clenched together, praying that her dad would arrive soon. It felt like forever, but then the door opened, and Adriel's dad rushed inside. He looked worried but calm, and as soon as he saw Adriel, he hurried over and hugged her tightly. "It's okay, Adriel," he said softly. "I'm here. We're going to fix this." Adriel felt the tears spill over as she hugged her dad back. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. And as she looked up at Officer Austin, she saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. It was as if, for the first time, he was starting to realize that he might have made a mistake. Adriel's dad, Mr. Davis, stood in the police station, hugging his daughter tightly. His heart ached seeing her tear-streaked face and trembling hands. He could feel her fear, and it made him both sad and angry. He knew Adriel was a good, honest girl, and the thought of her being treated like a criminal was almost too much to bear. He gently wiped her tears away and whispered, "It's going to be okay, Adriel. I'm here now." Officer Austin stood nearby, watching them with a puzzled look. He had expected a frantic, upset parent, but Mr. Davis was calm and composed. There was something in the way he carried himself that made Officer Austin hesitate. For a moment, he felt a twinge of doubt. Maybe he had been too quick to act, but he quickly pushed that thought aside, trying to convince himself that he was just doing his job. "Sir, I understand you're upset," Officer Austin began, clearing his throat. "But your daughter was caught shoplifting. We have to follow the rules, and that means bringing her in. She needs to understand that there are consequences for breaking the law." Mr. Davis turned to face Officer Austin, his eyes calm but firm. "Officer, I appreciate that you're trying to do your job, but there's been a misunderstanding. Adriel wasn't shoplifting. She had money to pay for everything, and I know she wouldn't steal. She's my daughter, and I trust her." Officer Austin was taken aback by how sure Mr. Davis sounded. He had heard parents defend their children before, but there was something different about this. "I'm sorry, sir, but I saw her with my own eyes. She was trying to leave the store with items she hadn't paid for." Mr. Davis raised an eyebrow, still keeping his cool. "Did you give her a chance to explain?" he asked, his voice gentle yet piercing. "Did you ask her why she had those items, or did you just assume she was guilty?" Officer Austin hesitated, not sure how to respond. He had been so certain that Adriel was trying to steal, but now he was starting to see the situation differently. "Well, she looked suspicious, and I've seen kids try to do this before," he stammered, trying to defend himself. "I was just trying to prevent a crime." Mr. Davis nodded slowly, understanding but not letting it slide. "I understand that you have a duty to protect the community, officer, but you also have a duty to be fair, to listen, and not to make judgments without knowing the whole story. And I think you might have jumped to conclusions about my daughter." The room was silent for a moment. Adriel was still holding onto her dad's arm, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. She didn't know how her dad was going to fix this, but she could see that he wasn't going to back down. She felt a little bit stronger just having him there, standing up for her. Mr. Davis took a deep breath. "I'd like to show you something, Officer Austin," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he took out a small card and handed it to Officer Austin. "This is my business card. I'm the owner of Davis Market, the store where you say Adriel was shoplifting." Officer Austin's eyes widened as he looked at the card, reading the words, "Davis Market. Owner, Marcus Davis." He glanced up at Mr. Davis, then down at the card again, unable to hide his shock. You're the owner," he stammered. "Yes, I am," Mr. Davis said, his voice steady. "And if you had taken the time to listen, you would have known that. Adriel was running an errand for me. She was buying some ingredients and a few extra things to make a dessert at home. She had money to pay, but she never got the chance to because you decided she was guilty without hearing her out." Officer Austin felt his face turn red. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been so sure, so confident that he was right, and now it turned out that he had made a huge mistake. I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, I thought." Mr. Davis didn't raise his voice, but there was a firmness in his words that made Officer Austin feel small. "You thought she was guilty because you saw a young black girl with a backpack, looking at her phone. You didn't stop to ask questions or listen. You just assumed. And that's not right, officer." Adriel watched as Officer Austin's expression changed. He looked like he was struggling to find the right words, but none came. He felt embarrassed, and the guilt was starting to creep in. He had treated Adriel unfairly, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Davis, Adriel," he said, finally looking at them both. "I made a mistake, and I shouldn't have assumed. I understand if you're angry." Mr. Davis nodded. "I appreciate your apology, Officer Austin, but this isn't just about being sorry. It's about making sure that something like this doesn't happen again. My daughter should never have been treated this way, and I hope you learn from this." Officer Austin swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. He knew he had messed up, and it was going to take more than just saying sorry to make things right. "I promise I'll do better," he said, his voice sincere. "I'll make sure to listen next time." As Mr. Davis nodded, the tension in the room seemed to lift a little. Adriel felt her dad's hand on her shoulder, and she knew everything was going to be okay. She had been scared, but her dad had come through for her, and now she felt safe again. The lesson was clear, and Officer Austin knew it. Assumptions had led to a mistake, and that mistake had hurt an innocent girl. Now he had to live with that and work on being better. As Adriel and her dad left the police station, Officer Austin watched them go, hoping he'd get another chance to prove he could be the fair, just officer he always wanted to be. As Adriel and her dad left the police station, the cool breeze outside felt like a breath of fresh air to her. She had spent what felt like an eternity inside, scared, confused, and alone, but now she was walking beside the person she trusted most. Holding her dad's hand, she felt safe and relieved, though she was still shaken by everything that had happened. Mr. Davis walked slowly, his arm around Adriel's shoulders, offering her comfort and warmth. He knew his daughter was still scared, and he wanted to do everything he could to make her feel better. But he also knew that what had happened couldn't just be forgotten. It wasn't enough that Officer Austin had apologized. There was a bigger lesson that needed to be learned, and Mr. Davis was determined to make sure of it. They made their way back to their car, and just as Mr. Davis opened the door for Adriel, Officer Austin came out of the station, hurrying toward them. "Wait," he called, his voice sounding a little breathless. Mr. Davis turned around, his expression calm but serious. He could see the guilt on Officer Austin's face, and he knew the officer had more to say. "I wanted to apologize again," Officer Austin said, his eyes focused on Adriel. "I'm truly sorry for the way I treated you. I was wrong, and I know that now. I didn't listen, and I made assumptions I shouldn't have. I understand if you're still angry, but I want you to know that I will learn from this." Adriel looked up at her dad, unsure of how to respond. She felt a mixture of emotions, relief, sadness, and a little bit of anger. She didn't understand why she had to go through such a scary experience, just because someone assumed she was doing something wrong. But she also saw how sincere Officer Austin seemed, and she remembered how her dad always told her that everyone deserved a chance to make things right. "I accept your apology," she said softly, her voice still a little shaky. "But it hurt when you didn't listen to me. I was scared, and I just wanted to go home." Officer Austin's face softened, and he felt a pang of guilt hearing Adriel's words. He could see how much his actions had affected her, and it made him realize just how powerful and dangerous assumptions could be. "I'm so sorry you felt that way, Adriel," he said. "I promise I'll do better. I'll make sure I listen to people from now on, and I won't jump to conclusions without knowing the full story." Mr. Davis stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Officer Austin's shoulder. "I appreciate you saying that, officer," he said, "but it's important to remember that this isn't just about you and Adriel. It's about how we treat each other, and how we make sure everyone is treated fairly and with respect. If you truly want to make things right, then you need to be willing to learn and change." Officer Austin nodded, understanding what Mr. Davis was saying. "I will," he said firmly. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again, not just to Adriel, but to anyone. I've learned my lesson today, and I'll work on being a better officer and a better person." Adriel felt a little lighter hearing those words, but she still had questions in her heart. "Why did you think I was stealing?" she asked, looking directly at Officer Austin. "Just because I was looking at my phone and had a backpack. I didn't do anything wrong." The question hung in the air, and Officer Austin felt like a weight had been placed on his shoulders. He didn't have an easy answer, but he knew he had to be honest. I made a quick judgment, and it was wrong," he said. "Sometimes people see things that aren't really there because they're looking for trouble, and they make mistakes. I'm sorry I treated you that way, and I hope you can forgive me." Mr. Davis smiled gently at his daughter, proud of how brave she was for asking the hard questions. "Adriel, you did nothing wrong," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You were honest, and you stood up for yourself even when things were scary. That takes a lot of courage." Officer Austin took a deep breath, feeling a mix of shame and hope. "If there's anything I can do to make things better, please let me know," he said. "And if you ever want to come by the station, I'll be happy to show you how things work here, so you can see that police officers are here to help." Adriel thought about it for a moment, and then nodded. "Maybe," she said quietly. "I just want to go home now." Mr. Davis nodded, and as they got into the car, he turned to Officer Austin one last time. "Thank you for understanding," he said. "But remember, words are important, and actions are even more important. I hope you'll make sure that no other child has to go through what Adriel did today." "I will," Officer Austin promised, his voice steady. "I'll do everything I can to make sure of that." As Mr. Davis drove away, Adriel looked out the window, feeling a strange mix of emotions. She was relieved to be leaving the police station, but she also felt stronger knowing that her dad had stood up for her, and that her voice had been heard. She knew that things weren't perfect, but she hoped that maybe, just maybe, people like Officer Austin would learn and change, so that others wouldn't have to face what she did. Back at home, Mr. Davis made sure to treat Adriel to her favorite dessert, They spent the evening baking together, and as the warm smell of cookies filled the kitchen, Adriel felt her heart start to heal. She knew that what had happened wasn't right, but she also knew that her dad would always be there to protect her. And that made all the difference. As they enjoyed their treats, Mr. Davis looked at Adriel and smiled. "You were so brave today," he said. "I'm proud of you." Adriel smiled back, feeling a little bit of pride herself. "Thanks, Dad," she said. "I'm proud of you too." Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.